Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Now What, a post-midterms analysis. My name is Kate Davis, and I'm a second year in the college from New York City, prospectively majoring in public policy and law letters and society. Here at the IOP, I have the privilege of working as the Speaker Series Logistics intern and was also fortunate enough to be a part of the 2022 Project Battleground cohort. As a member of the cohort, I spent the summer engaging with political strategists and campaign leaders from both sides of the aisle, learning everything from the ins and outs of targeted digital advertising to how to create opposition research briefs. As such, I've eagerly awaited the results of last Tuesday's midterms, as I'm sure many of you have as well, and I'm absolutely ecstatic to hear our expert panelists reflect on their outcome. First up, we have David Chalian, CNN's political director and vice president of political coverage. In his role, Mr. Chalian oversees CNN's political coverage, guides editorial content for special event programming, and provides on-air political analysis across all of the network's platforms. Prior to joining CNN, Mr. Chalian served as vice president for video programming at Politico, Washington Bureau Chief for Yahoo News, political editor and on-air political analyst for PBS NewsHour, and political director for ABC News. Mr. Chalian oversaw the PBS NewsHour coverage that won the prestigious Walter Cronkite Award for Excellence in Television Political Journalism. He additionally won an Emmy Award for his coverage of the 2009 presidential inauguration with ABC News. Next, we are lucky to have Nsé Ufot, former CEO of the New Georgia Project, a nonpartisan nonprofit founded by Stacey Abrams with the goal of educating, registering, and empowering voters of color and other marginalized communities in Georgia. Prior to her work with the nonprofit, Ms. Ufot began a career as a corporate lawyer and quickly became a labor rights activist. She served as the assistant executive director of Canada's largest faculty union, the Canadian Association of University Teachers, and thereafter as the senior lobbyist and government relations officer for the American Association of University Professors. Joining the New Georgia Project in 2014 and launching its Associated Action Fund in 2017, under Ms. Ufot's leadership, the organizations have registered over 600,000 Georgians to vote and have contributed to unprecedented voter turnout in the state. Last but certainly not least, we'll hear from Laura Dove, one of this fall's IOP Fellows and former Secretary of the Majority under Senator Mitch McConnell. In 2003, Ms. Dove was appointed as Assistant Secretary of the Majority. After a decade of excellent service, she was elected unanimously by the Republican Conference and ratified by the full Senate to become the party secretary. In her role, Ms. Dove forged consensus among senators from both parties, confirmed presidential nominations and treaty documents, and coordinated activities with the minority, House of Representatives, and executive branch. After retiring in 2020, Ms. Dove led federal relations for the Ford Motor Company and served as chair of the executive committee of the Alliance for Automotive Innovation and the vice chair of the Highway Users Foundation. Moderating tonight's discussion is IOP Director David Axelrod. Before we begin, please remember to silence your cell phones. Be mindful of questions you might like to ask, and be ready for a staffer to approach with a microphone. When this happens, remember that we give priority to students first. I'd also like to remind you of two other exciting Speaker Series events we have happening this week. Tomorrow from 5:30 to 6:45 p.m. at the Quadrangle Club, we'll have The Authoritarian's Playbook with IOP Pritzker Fellow Rana Ayub, investigative journalist Catherine Stewart, and Northwestern professor Elizabeth Shockman-Hurd. On Wednesday at International House from 5:30 to 6:45 p.m., the IOP will be partnering with UCHI Global and the Center for Latin American Studies for a conversation about democracy between former President of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, and New York Times national correspondent Simons Romero. Don't forget to visit the IOP's website for information on future Speaker Series events like these and other opportunities at the Institute of Politics. Without further ado, please join me in offering a warm welcome to our speakers, Mr. Chalian, Ms. Ufot, Ms. Dove, and David Axelrod. Thank you.
Thank you. Honestly, we have so much to talk about that now I regret inviting such accomplished people because the introductions were so long. I can't tell you how grateful I am and to all of you, Nsé and David. I know what your weeks and months have been like. Anyone who watches CNN appreciates that David was there day and night trying to explain the unexplainable and making these numbers make sense. And Nsé's been in the field in Georgia on trying to pull that vote out, and also day and night, I'm sure. And Laura, I don't know I wasn't there to judge whether your service to the Senate majority was excellent. I'm sure it was, but I know that your service as a fellow here has been excellent, and we're really grateful to you. So let's get to it. David, before the election, you and I had many conversations, and if you were handed a piece of paper that said, the president has a 43% approval rating, the economy, 80% of people had a negative view of the economy, 3/4 of the people said the country was in the wrong direction, and knowing the history of midterm elections, you would have said, that incumbent party is in for a really bad day. So what the hell happened?
Yeah, I was handed many such pieces of paper that
Yes.
said all those things on
Yeah.
it. Yes, but I'll just say, you are absolutely right. If history is our guide, there is no doubt that Democrats should have suffered tremendously in a way that they did not in this election season. I mean, environmentally, this was set up as an election where Republicans should have made pretty substantial gains. Now, that being said, all the polling in advance of the election indicated that the Republicans were poised to take the House, but that the Senate was going to be a coin flip. But just because, there were, I guess your former boss, Mitch McConnell, liked to use the term candidate quality issues on the Republican side in some of the key races.
He didn't use air quotes. But.
No, he didn't. He said it straight on. Yeah. And because of the nature of these states and some of the Democratic incumbents and fundraising advantage, whatever, it just in poll after poll, the Senate a 50-50 Senate looked like it was going to emerge. I mean, I think even McConnell was saying it's going to be one or two in either direction, right? So.
But in a year like this, you'd expect coin flips to go to the challengers.
No doubt about it. So one of the things I think we were waiting for is, towards the end of the election, is this whole thing just going to collapse entirely on the Democrats? And what the voters said on Tuesday as to why that was not the case is that there were some powerful cross currents to that environmental situation we just described, whether it was abortion rights or sort of the reemergence of the argument about democracy and election denialism and Trump that was sort of recentered in the conversation at the end, both from the president and I think also the attack on Paul Pelosi had something to do with that at the end as well. So those cross currents came back in a way into the environment at the end that I think prevented, that what we would have expected. I will also just say, as a political reporter, history constantly proves to be only so good of a guide. And so I always try very hard each political cycle to be open to what is new in this cycle. While history can provide some helpful hints along the way, that's all it can do. It does not, you have to be open to what's new and what's happening in front of you now.
Just one more for you off the top here. The thing that struck me very much on election night when I saw the exit polls, I'm sure it struck you as well, is that particularly in these battleground races, independent voters swung heavily to Democrats. The Democratic voters voted 96% for the Democratic candidates. The Republican voters voted 96% for the Republican voters. But the independent voters, small a swing as they might have been, were a decisive factor.
There's no doubt about it. I mean, I think Fetterman in Pennsylvania beat Oz by 20 percentage points among independent voters, double-digit victory among independent voters for Mark Kelly over Blake Masters in Arizona. Same with Raphael Warnock over Herschel Walker. I know neither got to 50, and that's going to go on to a runoff on December 6th. Also, double-digit advantage, Maggie Hassan in New Hampshire, I believe.
Only Nevada, I think, defied.
Only Nevada defied that, exactly. That was a bit smaller difference there. But I do think, David, it's a key point to understand. I think it gets back at the candidate quality thing I was alluding to in some of those races.
Yes.
But I also think it gets to what you were describing when you gave all those data points. I mean, the other thing the exit polls showed is that the plurality of Americans were dissatisfied about the direction of the country. And among that, I think it was like 41% that used the word dissatisfied when we asked sort of a 4-stage scale. And that's where the plurality of voters were. Of that 41% who say they were dissatisfied, they split evenly, basically, between the parties. It was like 50 to 48. So your independents going that way also indicate to me that, there are a lot of people who disapproved of the way Joe Biden was handling his job, who said they didn't like the direction that the country was going in, but did not take that out on the Democratic Party, the party in power.
Yeah, and so you were on the ground, and you're very much associated with Stacey Abrams and her efforts, but obviously your efforts were in service of the Warnock campaign as well. He won independents, as David alluded to, by 12 points. 12 points. Brian Kemp in the race against Stacey Abrams won independents by 1 point. And my question to you is this, because I think Trump plays very big in all of this. And did Trump's battle with Kemp actually help him with independent voters? Did it make him sort of kosher with some of those independent voters who voted for Warnock?
I won't ignore the impact that the Trump battle with Kemp had, like the bullying, let's just call it what it is, of Brian Kemp by the disgraced former president of the United States. But what I will say is that it's much more about how Kemp himself positioned himself, that he ran as a moderate, that he made more than just rhetorical overtures to a much broader section of Georgia. I will say that there's a robust Black and leadership class and business class, entrepreneurship class, and the idea that he was the first governor to fully open up his state while the rest of the country was like, oh my God, that there were a ton of business owners and entrepreneurs of all races and of all ideologies that really valued the decision that he made to put our lives at risk for profit. And so...
Is that how he put it, or?
No, that is not how he put it. But again, I think it's much more about him actually running as a moderate and him running away from his record. So he ran not as the person who banned abortion at 6 weeks in Georgia when no one asked him to. He actually wouldn't engage with the content at all. He wouldn't say whether or not he would support a national ban on abortion, et cetera. He ran as like a common sense gun law person, as opposed to the person who absolutely got rid of concealed carry permit requirements and this guns everywhere bill that he signed into law in Georgia. He ran as the person who stood up to Trump on that, during the 2020 presidential election and refused to participate in his criminal conspiracy to steal an election, but did not engage with Senate Bill 202, Georgia's voter suppression bill that changed over 50 of Georgia's election laws and created 5 new crimes.
Well, let me ask you about that. Do you know, a lot has been made of that the turnout was pretty robust, although I noticed that African-American turnout was no more robust. Tell me how you think those laws affected turnout.
Yes. I think they had a significant impact on turnout. So yes, there was historic levels of participation, but what you saw was people shifting from vote by mail ballots to early voting in person. One, because they've constructed so many artificial hurdles. I'm talking about cutting 100 days from the vote by mail timeline for when you can request and return your ballot. Significantly limiting drop boxes to 1 per county or 1 per 100,000 persons. So going from like 150 drop boxes in Fulton County and the metro Atlanta area down to like 40. Right? And so people shifted from vote by mail. So we had a 1 million vote deficit. When you consider absentee ballots. They took drop boxes, and instead of them being, so Drop boxes in every commercial context is supposed to give customers access to the business outside of business hours. And that is how they worked in 2020. After Senate Bill 202, drop boxes are not allowed to be outside of the business. So if the government building closes at 5 p.m., that's when access to the drop boxes closes. There weren't drop boxes available on election day.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is that what we saw was, as historic levels of turnout, it is a fact, but Georgians turned out in spite of these additional hurdles that they had to clear.
Just back to the election denier thing. The thing, if this were an unusual part of the election, I would be asking you less about it. But it seemed like people who embraced the election denial stuff did much more poorly generally across the country than people, unless they were in deep red kinds of districts and states, than people who resisted it. And that's why I asked about that. I suspect he would be, he probably wouldn't have gotten a primary if he hadn't, and if he had embraced the Trump thing, but he wouldn't have the ability to run away from it the way he did.
The thing that challenges me about that analysis, though, is that when you turn around and pass a bill that changes over 50 of Georgia's laws, as if you believed that there were deficiencies in the 2020 election. And so rhetorically, you can be like, we ran the cleanest election Georgia's ever seen. And then you turn around and completely enact the Trump agenda, completely enact a set of voter suppression laws that would,
and yet he ran 5 points ahead of Walker.
And yet,
okay.
It's Herschel Walker, though, bro. Like, really?
I don't know. He's pretty fast.
Let
me move on to Laura for a second. Laura, you are a Senate insider and a McConnell insider, and you know him well. Talk a little bit about that candidate quality thing and the frustrations you think that were there for him about this. So a number of these candidates, it was obvious that he was referring to the candidates who were thrust upon the Republican Party by Trump in Arizona, in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, and so on. How burdensome did he view that going in, do you think?
So, Leader McConnell's been the Republican leader since 2006, so he's had lots of different cycles, and I think he learned a lot from the 2010 cycle. I think when you talk about candidate quality, you talk about...
Yeah, he had the witch in Delaware. And
Christine O'Donnell in Delaware, in Murdoch in Indiana.
Right.
I think he learned the hard way that having a little bit of a steadier hand on, the tiller is probably better for the conference's prospects to regain the majority. And he has a very professional political operation and has raised, hundreds of millions of dollars to get those candidates. But he knows that there's only so much you can do with money. You're not going to get a witch elected to the Senate no matter how much you spend money on it.
Or a warlock, for that matter.
Yeah. So he cares about it. It's collaborative. He definitely is not going to Bigfoot the apparatus in the states, but he knows the hard way that if you pick the wrong candidates, the majority does not presto changeo materialize. He's very realistic that way.
Now, what does uniquely what control of the Senate means? And it means a lot. It means more than control, even control of the House means, because there are unique powers vested in the Senate. The rules are more complicated. Talk about what control of the Senate means in terms of the Biden administration and
Well, I think there are two halves to it. So in terms of the legislative agenda, I actually think having a strong Republican minority in the Senate is a huge opportunity for the president. It's not, McConnell and President Biden have made deals before. They can tack to the middle on things like supply chain, critical minerals, national security. And so I think Senator McConnell and President Biden have a good relationship and could probably get some stuff done in the center if the president chooses to set the table for that. The really, I think, hard part to swallow for Republicans is on the executive side. So now the the president's conveyor belt for judges won't slow down. So they'll have a huge opportunity over the next 2 years to really get a lot of those nominations confirmed. And that is the big difference, I think, in terms of Senate control.
Yeah, I mean, 84 judges confirmed already, 16 on the calendar, I understand. He's moving at a kind of record clip here, he and the Senate Democrats, to fill vacancies.
They are, and if they have nothing else to do, which if everybody goes to their corners and they're not actually making deals on any of
Lots
these
of time to
priorities,
confirm judges.
Lots of time to confirm judges.
Yeah.
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 And if the House Republicans impeach the whole cabinet, he's going to need cabinet replacements also. So.
Yeah, exactly. Well, they would have to take those up, right? I mean, those would all come up to the Senate if the House impeaches these people.
The impeachment proceedings for non-presidential appointments are more manageable than a presidential impeachment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think? What do you think McConnell thinks? And I presume you haven't talked to him about this, so you can sit here as an. Oh, maybe you have.
I don't know what it is.
Yeah, don't commit.
Yeah.
What do you think he thinks when he looks at what's going on the other side about what that means for him, for Republicans, and so on?
I think it's similar to, President Obama wrote a letter and left it in the desk for President Trump, right? Like the presidents know what it feels like to be president. So I think there's a lot of empathy amongst those big four leaders, McConnell, Pelosi, McCarthy, and Schumer, because it's a hard job and they know what it feels like to be in the barrel. So I think he's got a lot of empathy for Leader McCarthy and will try very hard not to make his life harder.
Yeah.
But he's also an extremely straightforward, like unemotional leader. So he will tell him straight, if you do these things, if we shut down the government, if you impeach the whole cabinet, if you impeach the president, here's what it's going to do to our agenda.
Isn't that, David, the sort of dilemma here? Because in order to be the Republican leader, you have to have Republicans unified behind you. You've got a cadre of these Freedom Caucus people who don't have any affection for Kevin McCarthy particularly, and have a very kind of Trumpian agenda.
In order to be Speaker.
To be Speaker.
Yeah. In order for Mitch McConnell to be Republican.
No.
Right, yeah.
No, I'm talking about a separate thing.
Yeah.
We'll get back to that. But it's sort of a paradoxical situation, too, because if he embraces the agenda of the Freedom Caucus, impeachments and so on, in order to stay as Speaker, he's also imperiling the Republican majority in these swing districts, which just voted a repudiation of that very kind of politics.
Exactly. It is a bind that McCarthy finds himself in, and probably not one that is going to surprise him terribly. I mean, remember, Kevin McCarthy was almost once Speaker before, and he saw when John Boehner was disposed of by the Republican conference of this very element that you're talking about, what would be required, and he wasn't able to get there in that moment. And so I don't think this particular bind that he's in is new for him. I think the math has gotten a little tougher for him. And so, I think there are two phases to this, assuming, as is the likely result here, that Republicans will be in the majority in the House. Kevin McCarthy has an immediate problem initially of just amassing the 218 votes that he'll need to become Speaker. And David, you are right. That is going to mean giving agency to and giving license to some folks inside the conference who are exactly what broadly the American people rejected in this election. So there's no doubt about that. And then, if indeed Kevin McCarthy is successful at becoming Speaker, I think the battle to become Speaker is only going to be just a little prelude to the unbelievably difficult position he will be in to actually try to govern and get stuff done. Even the basic functions of government, I think he's going to have a monumentally tough time with that narrow of a.
Well, and one of the things they're demanding apparently is the ability to vacate the speakership if they're unhappy, which puts them on an even shorter leash. So
why is this okay? Like, have we just accepted that, like, this current version of the Republican Party has lost their marbles? Like, I mean, it just doesn't feel like, should we be saying something? Like, should we call an adult?
Well, I mean, that really, I think, honestly, Nsé, that is what McCarthy had hoped. He spent $350 million trying to elect a broader majority, and in some cases trying to nudge out, Madison Cawthorn and others who he thought would be, but he didn't. I mean,
and then Marjorie Taylor Greene. Sorry,
well, yeah,
America.
No, I understand. This is a dilemma for him and the country. There's no doubt about it. One of the interesting things about this election, we've had change election after change election because people are upset with government and their leadership. This wasn't a change election. In fact, the only incumbent senator or governor who lost in the country, I think, was Steve Sisolak, the governor of Nevada. All the others were reelected. It's kind of extraordinary in this environment. So I guess it goes back to the original question, but it feels like, that we said all along, like the challenge for Democrats is to make this a choice and not a referendum. And I think that they succeeded in that with the help of Trump and others and Trump insisting that he be on the stage as well. So you had two presidents running around, and it worked out that way. Although I was saying earlier, now that it worked out the way it did, I'm sure Biden would be happy to refer to it as a referendum.
Although, even on that, David, in the exit polls, right, the country was asked if they want to see him run for president again in 2024, and a clear majority said no to that. I'm not suggesting that's going to weigh on
27% said yes.
President Biden's mind. Yeah, 27% said yes. And so, tough to, I'm sure you're right that Joe Biden sees this as a affirmation, and this was now a referendum, and he got a vote of affirmation, but I'm not sure. Again, as we were talking before.
Is there anything in the research that suggests that?
Part of the coalition are people who were disapproving. Part of the coalition for Democrats that staved off disaster for them are people who disapproved of Biden.
In fact, he won a majority of people who said they somewhat disapproved. I think he got 52% of those voters. Is that right? Am I
that the Democrats did.
Of Democrats.
Actually? Yeah. So it's, I think it would be tough in his most honest moments to see these results as a total affirmation of him.
And say, what do you...
I was going to say that we have quite a bit of research on our own, particularly around young voters and voters of color, specifically black voters in Georgia. And so there's a nuance to Biden's disapproval because there are also many folks who disapprove that he hasn't gone far enough. Or that he is pulling his punches and capitulating to the criminal caucus that is parading as a legitimate political party. And so...
You're talking about the Republicans?
I am very much talking about the Republicans.
They don't refer to themselves that way.
They don't refer to themselves as a criminal caucus?
No, I don't think so.
There's not a statesman among them. And it's deeply frustrating when we think about, so what we're talking about is, again, there's an obsession with polling, and there's not a critical conversation. I have not witnessed many critical conversations about how polling is covered. When I think about the way that the Republicans flooded the zone with garbage polls, and that we were all consuming them as if they were legitimate barometers of what people were thinking and feeling, and worse, as if they actually predicted what would happen. And they didn't, and then we all are going to return back to using them in the same
Yeah, it's
way.
an interesting thing, and I'm willing to confess to David here that I called him about the CNN polls, and I thought, gee, these look too rosy for Democrats. And he stuck up for him.
Well, listen, live by the polls, die by the polls. You're right one year and they might be off. So I don't want to do a bunch
But the
of...
polls, the truth of the matter is...
But the polls were not wrong here.
The polls were actually closer in this election than they have been in several cycles.
Exactly, but I want to speak to Nsé's point because I think this is hugely important about the reporting of polls and how polls are covered.
Right? Yeah.
And, at CNN, we have standards of what polls we can report on and not. I mean, they go through a rigorous methodological review before CNN will consider a poll reportable, much like any other reporting we do. We do a very serious review of sourcing to make sure information is accurate, and we treat polls, we apply as rigorous a test to polling. And so a lot of those polling averages that people are addicted to, whether at 538 or Real Clear Politics or what have you, they include partisan polls. Like you're saying, Republicans, they include partisan polls. Those are not allowed, those do not meet CNN standards for reporting. They're not in CNN's averages of polls. They include, outside group polls. Again, not approved at CNN standards. So we try very hard to make sure that when we are averaging polls or the polls we are presenting have met sort of a methodological test. Now, that doesn't mean there's not problems with polling. We discovered in 16 and 20 there are, and we work on that every day too. Mm-hmm. But I think, I'll give you another example, and then we can move on from the polling conversation because I don't want to bore everyone. But at CNN, after 16, we made an adjustment to our polling graphics because people, you see a graphic and you see numbers and you think it's a precision sort of thing, which polls are not. They are not precision instruments. And so if we have results now that are within the margin of error, it's a 2-point race, we don't label that, our anchors don't talk about it as somebody with a 2-point lead. It is a clear banner on the graphic, no clear leader in this race. It's on the screen. This is within the margin of error. You can't talk about this as a lead or not, because that's not what it represents. So I think it is on us in the press to make sure that as we're covering polls, we try to be clearer and clearer with the audiences about what this represents and what it doesn't, which is very different from all the political shop talk we all have in our conversations of this person's +2, this person's -4, what have you, and the obsession with the horse race. But I do think we are trying to make sure that it's not just trying to get polling right, which is a huge mission, as it's a constantly changing thing, but it's also getting right how we present and talk about polls.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, all of those caveats are right, and that's the way it should be presented. People still look at the numbers and say, oh my God, he's up 2, she's down 3, he's up, and no one says, but it's margin of error. That's not how people think. So, I mean, we overpoll and we get obsessed by polls because honestly, media organizations get, they get attention for their polls. And you see people reporting other media organizations' polls, even sometimes when the results are different than their own, because it's new, right? And it's another way to talk about it. How does that affect candidates?
I mean, I think that they become myopic and they start focusing on how they're doing in the polling. And here's the thing. Again, I don't want my comments to be interpreted as yes, I do think that there are changes and interventions that need to be made in the polling industry. I recognize its utility. I think that there's an over coverage of it and an overemphasis on it. And with its limitations, like people take it as gospel, they take it as a predictive tool. I think it affects fundraising. I think it affects confidence. And I think why I'm deeply concerned about it is as an organization that's responsible for doing voter education, right? For helping folks evaluate candidates against one another for where they stand on actual issues. Like the idea that because of Brian Kemp's refusal to expand Medicaid, we have 6 hospitals in Georgia that have closed and 19 on the way, right? And that is going to have a deep impact on how people get access to health care. And instead of that being covered, the substantive when I think about journalism, when I think about news, when I think about political coverage, and the need to inform people in this moment with so much misinformation and so much disinformation, particularly online. Just the idea that there are fewer and fewer places where folks can go to get an analysis about these candidates and where they're standing and what your vote actually means, because there's an obsession with the horse race. People talking about, this is the rematch from 2018, et cetera. And I just don't know the value
I think
of that.
there are places you can go, but there's so much content out there that I think people get kind of overwhelmed by it. Let me ask you one more question on that flows from all of this. If the exit polls are right, and if the other data is right, the Democratic Party, which has been reliant on African American voters, on Latino voters, the Hispanic communities, I like to call them, because it's not just one community.
This is a fact.
There's been some erosion of support, particularly among younger black men and among significant elements of the Hispanic community. I mean, 4 years ago, 40% lead for Democrats among Latinos. Now, 21% in this election. Varied from place to place, and Florida probably brings the average down.
Exactly.
But what is
In Florida.
what is your message to the Democratic Party?
So, thanks, David, for this question. I think that one of the things that is remarkable about this current version of the Republican Party is the clarity about who their base is, and their desire to make sure that there's no daylight between their platform and the priorities of their base, for good or for ill. I know I always have spicy commentary, but there's a clarity and a discipline. I do not see that level of clarity and that level of discipline and that level of commitment to the base. And I also understand that it is a challenge because it's a coalition party. And as one party moves further and further to a place that normal Americans don't want to access, then folks, because we are in a large country with only two major parties, folks find themselves...
Spoken like a Canadian.
I mean, I'm just saying there are more people in California than there are in Canada, and yet...
But it feels like there is the Democrats have a working class problem that they need to address. That working class black voters, working class Latino voters, and working class white voters are all targets that they need to think about in expanding that coalition. Isn't that true?
It absolutely is true, and these are winning issues. I know that they seem unpopular because there's polling that says that student loan debt forgiveness is not wildly popular, but it is. Yes, these are winning issues. If they are serious about winning, then they need to be clear about who their base is and make sure that the platform speaks to the priorities that their voters are telling them they want to see, and that they should not be dissuaded by the disinformation that's coming from their partisan opponents.
Yeah. We'll get back to this. Laura, tomorrow it's a big day. Donald Trump will apparently make his quadrennial announcement that he's running for president. What happens now? I mean, because I've never seen, this is one of the most astonishing things after this election is that all these people who were with Trump, they stuck with him through the election denial, they stuck with him through the insurrection, and now the day after the election say, whoa, we can't lose. Losing is the unpardonable sin. And so you see a lot of professional sort of establishment politicians and media people, yes, I'm talking about you, Rupert Murdoch, jumping off the bandwagon in a really significant way. How do you read all of that? And do you think, can the Republican Party quit Trump? Because Trump still has, obviously, a committed base of supporters.
Well, I think for the next year or so, you are going to see at least Republicans in the Senate just putting their heads down and trying to do their jobs, which is what they've been trying to do for a couple of years. There's a lot of work to be done on financial services, on supply chain issues, on manufacturing policy. That's what they're there for. And I think that the circus atmosphere elsewhere in Washington, I mean, people, I always laugh because I'll be like, oh my gosh, we had the most exciting day in the Senate. And my husband will say, that's exciting? I'm like, that was exciting for us, you know, with the gentle lady yield, or, you know, they're very formal, but they're, you know, they're there on 6-year terms. There are 100 of them. They know each other really well. You're going to have some new leadership at the Banking Committee with Tim Scott. I know he's got an agenda on monetary policy. It's not very exciting to the American people, but it will make a big difference.
I heard a murmur go through the crowd.
Well, I mean, there are economic issues that they would like to tangle. They're going to tangle with. They are going to have a very emboldened and strong minority in the Senate, and I have seen Mitch McConnell as a very strong minority leader. He is not a chump, but he's also not going to just sit there.
Yeah. Do you think that do you think his life will be harder with? He's losing a lot of his wingmen, you know, Blunt and
Portman and
yeah.
Jimmy and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, J.D. Vance is replacing Rob Portman, and that in a sense summarizes the situation, because you got a guy who went all in with Trump, was, you know, had unkind things to say about McConnell, clearly is ambitious. And the problem in the Senate is it's always sort of like you've got a school of presidential wannabes.
Right. Well, I mean, see, this is the beauty of McConnell, is truly he wakes up in the morning, looks in the mirror and says, gosh, I would really like to be, well, the majority leader, but Republican leader's fine. He's going to be the longest serving Senate leader in history.
Within the next few weeks of January.
Yeah, on January 4th. Truly,
but who's counting?
He has never looked in the mirror and said, I want to be president, as opposed to a solid proportion of his colleagues in the Senate who wake up I mean, did you remember that Michael Bennet in Colorado had run for president? I mean, all of them have had exploratory committees, at least in their heads at some point.
Yes.
That is not him. That is not he. His compass is really pointed towards governing in the Senate, and so I think there have been a lot of political maneuvers around him ever since he's been the leader in 2006. And I don't think it's gonna. I think he's not gonna. He's pretty.
So don't bet against the old crow, is what you're saying.
His compass does not move.
Yeah. Just before we go to questions, I just want to ask David something, because we talked about this before we came out. It was so interesting to watch the elections in Pennsylvania and New York, because New York, one of the bluest states by tradition in the country, was kind of a killing field for Democrats. I mean, much of the Republican majority, if there is to be one in the House, will have been built in New York State.
Definitely, yep.
And Pennsylvania, which was thought to be a place of great jeopardy for Democrats, ended up, their incumbent members of Congress survived, and obviously they won the Senate race there and took a Republican seat. Yep. So explain why that border.
Yeah, I just thought, here are these neighboring states, and I think they perfectly encapsulate the cross currents in this election, because you're absolutely right. When and if, but likely the Republicans will win the House, there's no doubt that their gains in New York will be the thing that put them in the majority. And how could it just a few miles away over the border or whatever, you see these 4 competitive districts in a very purple state like Pennsylvania stay Democratic? You noted you flipped the seat. You have a Democratic governor elected to replace a Democratic governor and keep that in Democratic hands. And I do think what I was saying before, New York succumbed to the environment, the political environment, because I think there was not real fear among voters in New York that their abortion rights with Kathy Hochul in the governor's seat were really at risk, or that democracy, you don't have an election denier that is going to be in charge. And so, I mean, I know the Hochul-Zeldin race was closer than people anticipated, but I don't think there was a real sense among New York voters, where in Pennsylvania, I think Democrats saw in Doug Mastriano, and independents saw in Doug Mastriano, and maybe Mehmet Oz as well, a fear about abortion rights in the Commonwealth there, and a real concern about democracy. And I think you saw that. I mean, in fact, Pennsylvania, according to the exit polls, there were only 2 states where abortion was a higher rated issue for voters than inflation was. Pennsylvania and Michigan, where abortion was literally on the ballot in a ballot measure. Those 2 states were the only 2 that had that outcome of voters putting issues, and I think it had a lot to do with what was happening at the top of the ticket and how voters responded.
That was such an interesting facet of this election. The fact that the abortion issue was much more potent in states where abortion was actually in question, abortion rights were in question. So we're going to take some questions. What we want you to do is raise your hand. I can't really see you anyway because these lights are in our face. Raise your hand, and someone with a microphone, someone right here, and there's another person with a microphone as well, will come to you. So you got a question back here? Okay.
Hi, Nsé Ufot. I'm a huge fan. My name is Graham. I'm a second year at the Public Policy School. So as we learn in Laura's seminars, the most precious commodities in Washington is Senate floor time. Last time you were here, you talked a lot about H.R. 1 and getting that passed for voting rights reform. Can you talk about, in your current advocacy work, how you view that compared to the other things President Biden has gotten through, and how you think he should prioritize that kind of legislation in the next session?
I still think that access to the vote, like unfettered, unmolested access to the vote, is critical to having a sort of robust democracy and having any belief that we have the ability to hire and fire leaders. And so, like, restoring the Voting Rights Act is a huge priority for me, is a huge priority for those of us who do this work. And I'm deeply concerned because, I mean, we are looking at a Supreme Court, a rogue Supreme Court, that could continue to gut the Voting Rights Act. And so while we were pushing for H.R. 1 for strengthening the Voting Rights Act, we literally have a branch of government that looks like it is poised to weaken it even further, if not get rid of it essentially altogether, or all of its enforcement mechanisms. And so I know that I bring the least sexy topics to the political conversation.
I don't know, Laura was talking about...
You did talk about...
Financial services reform, yeah.
You guys want to debate this?
And supply chain.
Who has the
Supply
most?
chain.
Yeah.
But it still feels very fundamental. It still feels very existential, and it also feels like the long game that's being played to sort of insert or interfere with the will of the people, and making sure that the will of the people is reflected in the results of our elections. We didn't talk much about gerrymandering and the impact that it has had on sort of our ability to actually have, majorities. That
It may be that gerrymandering will have played a really significant role in this election. I mean, the Republican margin may be guaranteed by or delivered by dint of gerrymandering, which Democrats did as well. We're sitting here in Illinois.
I would argue that given the enthusiasm that we saw amongst Democratic voters, that gerrymandering muted the impact, and so that we could have seen larger margins.
Next question.
Okay. Hello, my name is Juan. I'm a second year in the college, and so my question is, kind of going into the New York and Pennsylvania thing, we also saw 2 other states with control gains for one of the 2 parties, that is Florida, backed by Governor Ron DeSantis, and Michigan, of course, backed by Governor Gretchen Whitmer, which both of them have a decently strong national profile in their respective parties. So my question for any of you all, what can each of their respective parties learn from the performance of the party and their governors in each of those 2 states?
You want to take that?
Sure. So, I think Florida was a really big success story for Republicans, for Ron DeSantis specifically, and for Republicans more broadly. He was running against not the strongest Democratic candidate out there in Charlie Crist, who himself was a former Republican. But the success that they had, that Republicans had in traditionally Democratic strongholds in the state, in Miami-Dade County and Broward County. We were talking about the Latino vote earlier, the success that Republicans had there. And Ron DeSantis's just personal approval in the state for somebody who really does play base politics more than not. He had a pretty broad victory. And so, listen, Florida is a state that has been trending red. I mean, I think one of the big questions, David will be better to answer this than I will, but one of my big questions going into the 2024 presidential cycle, do Democrats have to have a serious conversation about investing in Florida and competing in Florida as a presidential battleground state?
Yeah.
I'm very intrigued to see that. And Michigan, just to answer there, I think Michigan was very similar to what I was saying about Pennsylvania. Because abortion rights was literally on the ballot in a measure, because of Gretchen Whitmer's position, and because of her opponent, Tudor Dixon's position on that issue, I think the Democratic enthusiasm that Nsé was just talking about was turbocharged in a place like Michigan. It is very interesting when you see, that so-called blue wall that we talked a lot about in 2016 in the map that Donald Trump busted through to be able to win the presidency, and that Joe Biden began restoring in 2020, got fortified for the Democrats in 2022. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. Look at the state legislative stuff that went on in that region. The governors. I think it's I think that the Democrats found even more fortification in that region of the country.
Yeah, and that is going to be significant in 2024. What about Whitmer as a
presidential prospect?
Well, I mean, as a national player.
Yeah. First of all, we all know. I mean, the reporting from 2020 was Biden was very enamored with her, throughout the vice presidential selection process. When you think about what she went through in her state and how she dealt with the COVID restrictions and the backlash from that, and her own sort of personal life in danger potentially, and what have you. She emerges obviously with this strong re-election victory, I think, in probably as a strong position she's ever been in. And she does have a lot of fans sort of in the establishment and donor class. I think we're probably going to see a lot more from Gretchen.
Yeah, I would say that the attempt to kidnap her, kill her, whatever it was, really did bring the election denier insurrection issue to the forefront in Michigan. I think it was meaningful. You've got hands over here.
I do think that what is underreported in the Florida story is the divestment from field operations. When you think about what it takes to win a Democratic victory in a place like Florida and hold on to it, that there are non-party civic engagement groups, some of them have associated IEs, et cetera, that are doing deep organizing in communities of color, specifically with Latino voters and Black voters, that people do not see that as political work. And so even when you have candidates who get historic levels of fundraising, when you starve the field in this particular way, and these folks who are doing the year in and year out tilling of the soil, that is often unreported and work that is invisibilized when people think about what it takes to flip a state, et cetera.
You're arguing against yourself because that money that would go to Florida probably is going to end up in Georgia. So anyway, let's take another question here.
Thank you, guys. My name's Henry. I'm a second year in the college. So the commentary after the midterms, it seems, is like the Democrats won. It's been a referendum. But there's still, like in Nevada, Arizona, like 48% of people are still voting for people like Adam Laxalt, Carrie Lake, Tudor Dixon, 45 to 50%, the election deniers. So they're not going away quietly, and there are still a lot of people that are supporting them. So if someone could touch kind of on that and where you see these people going from there, and are you still concerned that that many people still vote for these types of candidates?
Well, I mean, Arizona was a traditionally Republican state that I think, you know, if Florida's going in one direction, pretty clearly Arizona's a purple state now. But, you know, we all talk about democracy, and, you know, part of it is people get to vote for who they want to, and that's a closely divided state. So I think that the message in Arizona is that, you know, sort of Mark Kelly, kind of unflamboyant, kind of nose to the grindstone, you know, less partisan politics is it sells there. But each state, you know, has a different character to it. I don't know, Henry, about that.
I just want to get your thoughts on election denialism. If you think this, from the Republican Party, do you believe that election denialism, that this election will have some impact in eradicating that element of the GOP, or no?
I think if the Republican Party can focus on election integrity and stop with election denialism, we'll get a lot more done. Yes, I feel like that is a fringe element that needs to be addressed and disposed of.
And do you think these election results will do that inside your party? Yep.
I hope so, yeah.
I mean, look, I guess the question is, I don't think you can deny that election denial was a big thing in these elections, because Republicans who embraced it did much less well than Republicans who didn't. The question is, you know, do practical politicians within the Republican Party, and you work for probably the most practical of them all.
He's very practical.
Do they say, you know what, this is a loser, this argument, and we spent too much time on it, and we nominated people who made this the center of their campaigns, and that was a mistake?
Yeah, I think it's time to look forward, provide an agenda, maybe get some stuff done for the American people who are having a hard time, you know, buying milk and filling their gas tanks, and have real issues that they care about, and the Congress can do stuff about it. The House can set the agenda even with a small number of Republicans. The Senate can help move it to the center, and the president can participate in that. I mean, it could happen.
Yeah.
I just don't
It should happen.
I'm concerned about the appetite that we have for lies, or, you know, let's figure out whatever the polite way is we want to frame it. But just discourse that is not based in fact or reality, as just accepting, you know, like the way that, I guess, the health inspector says that there's like an acceptable amount of poop that can be in your food, right? That we are growing more and more comfortable with people disassociating themselves from the facts and like beating these messages.
And isn't part of the verdict of this election that we're not all that comfortable with it? I mean, just these people have serially sort of been mowed down in this election. If Carrie Lake indeed loses, which seems more likely than not at this point, it's not done, and David Chalian would taser me if I suggested that it was before the CNN decision desk.
Yeah. You heard it here first.
Says so, but I mean,
Did you just put that in air quotes?
He did.
I mean, it's a real thing.
No, it is. Yeah, it is a real thing. But I'm not sure. I mean, the people who put this front and center in their campaigns, she was thought to be a solid front runner in that race. You know, polling may have been a little less bullish, but because of the flamboyant nature of her, and if she goes down, her epitaph will be election denier. That was what she predicated her campaign on. There's no doubt that we've got problems with we've got big problems, not just in politics, but generally with the sort of social media culture, frankly, cable culture that pushes people into silos, and and where your views are affirmed but not necessarily informed. That's a big problem for us. But I actually think we ought to stop and acknowledge that the American people had an opinion on this, and they expressed it in this election, which is why it's a historic election that kind of turned the norms on their head about what.
Except they're not going away, David. Right?
Well, you know what? I'll settle for this progress, and then, we got to deal with a whole range of issues around that. But anyway, I don't want to take up who's got the mics here?
Hi, I'm a student, first-year student from Harris. My name is Ayman. And my question was about crime being an issue in the midterm elections. So the results, I feel like, are a little bit inconclusive as to how potent of an attack it was. Like, for example, in New York, it seemed to have actually worked as an attack on Democrats. But just in neighboring Pennsylvania, John Fetterman actually won amongst voters who prioritize crime more, versus Oz. But in New York, that attack seems to have worked. So I guess my question is, how big of an issue is it for Democrats, and how much of a potent attack it is for Republicans?
I defer to.
How big was it in Georgia?
So crime / gun violence polled or was consistently a top 3 issue with Black voters, young voters, women and femmes, who are the universes that we prioritized in our research. And it still led them to choose Abrams and Warnock over Kemp and Walker. So it's a messy issue. I think that, again, if you look at how crime was positioned in the news and in press coverage as it relates to the midterm elections, that there was one particular party that was using it as a blunt force object to sort of beat voters and critics into submission. And it's not clear to me overall. I think that for us, so it stayed a top 3 issue for Black voters, and it did not lead them to voting for the Republican. So that's what I observed.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because it was used, including here in Illinois, but where people really do feel it to be a major issue. But it's in different places, it had different effects. There's no doubt in New York, as the questioner suggested, that was the issue, that it was very much the issue in the governor's race, and it spilled into the congressional races, and that was the issue.
And the mayor of New York, Eric Adams, sort of is a part of that. I think a lot of Democrats were concerned that his messaging around crime sort of fed into the way the Republican Party was trying to frame the narrative around it in New York. So that sort of helped solidify.
You may not know this off the top of your head, but among people who said crime was a major issue for them, how did they split?
I don't know it off the top of my head. Sorry. I brought some of the exit polls with me, but I don't have that one. I'll get back to you.
That's all right, because we can take another question.
They definitely favored the Republicans nationally, because the 2 issues that favored the Democrats on the list were gun policy and abortion. But inflation and crime and the other things tested favored the Republicans. So I just don't know what the percentages are.
Hi, my name is Henry Smith. I'm a first year at the college. With Biden's low rates and old age being 2 factors that very much so threaten his power as president, do you think there's any chance that he is simply saying he will run again in 2024 in an effort to sort of stave off some early onset lame duck period?
What are you guys saying in the group chat, David?
Well, I mean, I think that there is a concern about being a lame duck. Historically you lose influence. There are cross pressures. If in fact his intention is not to run, I think that the later the announcement, the more complicated the Democratic Party's situation is, because there's no time for a campaign. And campaigns are actually how we learn about people. It's how we, it's sort of the most rigorous oral exam in history, and I saw my own candidates and other candidates tested. Some were found wanting and others grew. And the Democratic Party surely would need that. So I don't know that he's playing any sort of game. My sense is he's genuinely trying to decide what he will do.
Do you think a late start to the Democratic nomination race, if he chooses not to run, benefits anyone in particular?
I think it benefits people who already have a national network, or who are celebrities, or who are very wealthy, and can run a lot of TV ads in a hurry. But it disadvantages more a dark horse candidates, people who are less well known and don't start off with a big national network. And I think that may be problematical for the party. Another question?
Yeah. Excuse me. Nari Safavi, simply a voter in Chicago. I'm thinking in terms of potential reforms or ground rules for media that could be very easily adopted in terms of how we cover these elections. It just seems like there was a lot of noise, but there wasn't a lot of information available. And could we prevent junk polling? Could we, short of wholesale campaign finance reform laws, what doable potential reform is there that we could accomplish in the short term?
I mean, I don't know about reforms in the press that would require them a certain way to cover an election. It sort of would infringe on the whole freedom of the press thing. So I'm not sure there are reforms there. I don't know if somebody wants to speak to the reforms.
And there's a lot of good information out there. I mean, there's a lot of noise out there, but there's also a ton of really good information out there for, if you want to be an informed voter, it's not hard to be an informed voter.
I don't know if I agree with that. I think that when you think about the fact that Gen Z, well over 90% of them get their information from social media, right? And that online outlets don't have, I think, the same rigor that we heard from David today about what gets reported and what gets covered. I think that digital media literacy is a real thing, that my 80-year-old mom is particularly vulnerable to online disinformation for very different reasons than my 18-year-old nephew, right? And so I don't think the platforms, I don't think government, I don't think that we have the tools yet. I mean, yes, there is digital media literacy, check the URL, check the dates, et cetera, check the outlet. But I think that there is more that can be done, especially when we see bad actors, both foreign and domestic, with big budgets, flooding the information wells with trash.
Yeah, well, we have a situation, we have misplaced incentives in the media and in politics where outrage keeps people coming back. And that's been the great insight of the social media platforms, that if we keep people outraged and we shove them into these rooms, that they will stay and they will buy things. And so, I do think we have to confront that. I'm into negative here, but it says, there's a mixed message that says, please take one more question and then wrap up. So I'm going to take advantage of that and take one more question.
Hi, my name is David. The politician that I thought gave the best performance of this whole cycle was Barack Obama. And I thought that his speeches were so electrifying, and you could tell he was extremely serious and passionate, but he was having fun. And he believed in the process, and the process would work itself out. And I'm curious on two levels. One, do you think his participation had any significant impact in key states? And then two, is there any way that politicians that aren't Barack Obama caliber can tap into that same energy and sort of carry that message forward?
First, I just want to say that is a bold and brave position to take on the south side of Chicago.
Right.
Yes. And you read it exactly as written. And say, did his appearance in Georgia make a difference?
I think it did. I think that, one, it was a reminder of what it was like to have a leader that communicated in a way that you felt like you understood, it made sense. There's also a part of it that's like the cool, like he graduated from school and comes back during finals week and is like really refreshed and like we're all haggard and dragging to get to the next final. And he comes in and is like, what's up, guys? And so it was part pep rally and like the wind in a lot of the organizers' sails. I think that was important. I think leaders, I think donors, like there was value in that in terms of the last push. So yeah, I mean, yes. Like, I'm not going to discount the impact that it had. I don't know if I would go as far as you went in your tweet.
Oh, thanks for reading my tweet.
I mean, of course.
No, I mean, listen, the last thing I would do is denigrate the incredible work that people have been doing for a long period of time. All I was saying is that, you know, those kinds of things, those speakers at the end, they're like the field goal team, right? So the team gets the ball 80 yards down the field, and then someone comes in and helps get it across.
It matters.
And that's the role that he played, that, you know, a kind of closer role. Without the work that went before it, that becomes a lot less meaningful. But he, you know, I think he indisputably cut the messages in a way. I thought the content of the messages were smart for Democrats, and I think they came at the right time. Because he has appeal not just to the base of Democratic voters, but also to independent voters, and I think he spoke to them. Anyway, listen, I so appreciate all of you for what you do, what you did here, what you do generally. Democracy is helped by good, smart, honest reporting, by people who really care about how government operates and helps it operate better, and by people who help put good people into places to make a difference. So I'm so pleased to be with all of you. And let me just say a word about this. We talk about democracy, again and again, but it is a beautiful thing to behold when it unfolds itself and reveals itself, and the American people get their say. And I think they are undervalued in this process, because I think they have been observant, they've watched, and, you know, generally these things are about putting a pedal to the brake of the incumbent. And I think they saw something that disturbed them, and they put a pedal to that brake, and that was, you know, these incursions on democracy, on voting, on elections. I think there was a message in that, and it was extraordinary to watch. And, you know, I've never been so happy to be wrong. And I've been wrong a lot. So I've got a big sample size to judge from. But it's going to be an interesting, challenging couple of years. And I hope you guys will keep coming back here and keep voting as well. And thank you again to everyone.
Thank
you.